All right. I'm so excited because I've got my friend, Dr. Peter Hotez, who I've known a long time and who I think is a national hero. And I'm so excited whenever I get the opportunity to talk to you. And thank you very much for agreeing to do this today. How are you?
Oh, great to be a real honor, Pete, and I always love our conversations, and it's always good to see you. I'm going to be 68 this year, so it's good to see anybody. So, it's
Are you really? What is that like? How's the
yeah,
six
yeah,
how's the 60
yeah, yeah.
decade?
Yes, estoy viejo. Yeah, I'm doing okay. I'm good. I'm good. I'm good. I'm still in the mix, and we're still saying useful things at lab meetings and with our scientists, and hopefully, and writing papers and writing a new book, which I'm really loving, on retelling the history of Texas through the lens of our epidemic. So I just signed up with MIT Press for that. And this is the most, I really love this book because, after writing several books on anti-science and anti-vaccine movements, it takes you to a very dark place every time. So
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
nice to kind of mix it up and
Yeah, I think
talk
the last
about
time I
this,
talked.
even though it's related in some ways, but it's the history of Texas and the New World and the American frontier is so fascinating, and how diseases came in and completely altered the course of the Texas Revolution and Union occupation and the Civil War, and and how it affected the colonization of Spanish Texas and the outcomes of these things. I'm just absolutely loving this, and I get to spend time. We have this, and this is the last word I'll say because I know you want to talk about other things, but we have this incredible McGovern historical collection at our Texas Medical Library. It's one of the biggest libraries, and it's just such a joy to go there in our Houston Public Library, and I'm just loving it.
I'm glad to hear that. I'm excited to read the book. It's really important, obviously. It's interesting just because it's a history book, and it would seem that we have to keep relearning history with all that's going on, whether it be around race or religion or anything. It seems like every generation or every other generation has to relearn the terrible things. It's such a upsetting phenomenon, but it's also true not only when it comes to social issues, but when it comes to science. Like I guess maybe I thought that vaccines had eradicated diseases that had killed millions and millions of people, and that would be something that we wouldn't need to relearn. Did you ever think,
Well,
that
we both of us, I know you're younger than me. We both grew up in this heroic age, right, where being a scientist meant something, right? And I did my MD and PhD in New York in the 1980s, and tell you how long ago that was. When I met my wife in New York, we lived in Rockefeller Institute housing for $44 a month on the Upper East Side of New York. That's how long ago it was.
wow.
And I wanted to make vaccines for parasitic disease because I wanted to be like Jonas Salk, because he was my hero, and I got to meet Dr. Salk, and never dreamed that you'd have to defend vaccines from somebody who's actually the Health and Human Services Secretary of all people. And so I say, as life, as John Lennon says, life's what happens when you're busy making other plans. I had a plan, right? I met Anne, we're going to celebrate our 40th anniversary not too long, and wanted to make vaccines for the world, and I'm doing that, and showing there's a way to bypass some of the big pharma companies to do it. But then, had Rachel, who has autism and intellectual disabilities, and started talking to Kennedy almost a decade ago, and wrote a book about why vaccines did not cause Rachel's autism. And that made me public enemy number one or two, which is not what I anticipated, having a parallel career defending vaccines. That I never would have dreamed of, but there you are. But anyway, I do appreciate, one of the things, great thing about talking to you is I get to really explain things in more
Yeah.
depth, and people get to see me as a person, not just as a talking head. And I do it, and I think that's important for scientists, because I think what the bad actors do is they operate by assuming that people will think we're shadowy figures in white coats plotting nefarious things, and so for them to see us as real people, I think, is really critical.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I appreciate how accessible you have been, not only to me, but to so many others in media who want to ask you questions. It's so disappointing to see the kind of degradation of respect for credibility, for expertise specifically. It's like, it's just so frustrating to listen to people that have no idea what they're talking about act like they're experts on issues. That kind of arrogance has always irked me, which is why I've always hosted a daily show where I interview experts. I ask them questions because I'm an expert on absolutely nothing. I've gotten pretty good at interviews, though, which is why I'm glad you're here, because there's a lot of things I want to ask you about. Just the general state of the union of health and science. We can talk about that, but there are a couple specific stories that I wanted to ask you about. So let me just get those kind of out of the way, which is, just talk to me about the state of the measles outbreak and how concerned you are about that. Dr. Oz went on the other day, he went on CNN, and he did say out loud, everybody should get their measles vaccine. Others have been, wishy-washy on it, but I think that's why not only is there an outbreak in the U.S., but I heard that there is in Mexico. There has been in other countries as well. So let's just talk about measles and how far.
Yeah, I wish Dr. Oz would take over from Kennedy as Health and Human Services Secretary. I mean, I know he has his issues too, but at least he's a serious person. He's a serious cardiothoracic surgeon from Columbia Presbyterian, and I used to go on his show a lot during the pandemic.
Oh, really?
I must have gone on half a dozen times,
Oh, wow.
and it was great. He was all in, very respectful, asked the right questions. We did a lot of good, and the reason I liked going on his show was after Fox News cut me off because I wouldn't go along with the hydroxychloroquine nonsense. There was a whole group of America that was walled off that I couldn't reach, and so Oz gave me that opportunity. So I was very grateful that he
Didn't know
did
that.
that. So
Yeah, I
yeah,
remember
no,
he's
yeah.
been on Joe Rogan's show several times, and then I remember you telling me you texted him and like, have me back on, and he just ignored you. Isn't that right?
Yeah, he was, he let me on once before the pandemic and once early on. And then about during the Delta wave, he went down this whole ivermectin rabbit hole, and then I was cut off, and then I couldn't get back on. And
So weird.
that was weird. Yeah.
All right.
Um,
So getting to the state of measles. I mean, why?
yeah,
How?
yeah. So let's talk about measles first. So, um, first of all, measles is back. Officially not back, but it's back. So what do I mean by that? So the Centers for Disease Control, when measles was eliminated in 2000, it set up this criteria to say when a country had eliminated its measles and when it hadn't. And the criteria was, 12 months of no continuous measles. And now we've had that. The only technical glitch, I'm not saying the elimination status is over, is because it's happened in 3 separate epidemics and we haven't connected those 3. So the biggest one was the one in my state of Texas, started in West Texas, moved up into the Panhandle, across the border into New Mexico, up the southern Great Plains, into Colorado, Kansas, Oklahoma. 2 kids died. That went from January to August last year. And then around that time, there was a second one in Arizona and Utah. And now we've got this third one in South Carolina with a lot of sick kids. So if you were to connect those over the period of a year, we've lost our elimination status. But, I don't think we have all the I's dotted and T's crossed to be able to definitely say those 3 are connected. So maybe officially we haven't lost our elimination status, but Pete, we've lost our elimination status. Measles is back. I mean, this is an ongoing thing. And the other thing you need to know about measles is in the pre-vaccine era, which we're looking more and more like, epidemics peaked at the end of winter, early spring. And so guess what period we're entering? End of winter, early spring. So
Right.
the worst is yet to come. And that's when it peaked in our epidemic. So the worst is not over, I don't think. So we should get ready for that. And so measles is back, but also pertussis is back, whooping cough. I mean, we've had a 6-fold rise in 2023 to 2024. The numbers are as high in 2025. And so that's back too. And there's more to follow, unfortunately.
So where is the federal government's guidance on measles? Where are pediatricians across the country on measles as well? I mean, it would seem that, by the way, states and individual pediatricians groups that represent them and so on are often ignoring the federal guidance from the CDC, which I never thought we would see. Not to mention that sometimes, often insurance companies are as well, because obviously they don't want people getting sick. They don't want to pay out policies. So where are we on that vaccine?
Yeah, I mean, HHS and CDC are in a parallel universe. They are no longer reliable, and their advisory committees are no longer reliable. They're just stacked with ideologues and anti-vaccine activists. So what's happened is, the American Academy of Pediatrics has, gone rogue in the sense and just, putting out their own messages, which are evidence-based and science-driven. And the other thing that's happened, Pete, I was up in Boston at the end of last year, and a coalition of states in the Northeast have gotten together to create their own mini-me version of CDC. So Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, probably a couple of others. And the same things happen on the West Coast with California, I think Washington, Oregon, I think Hawaii's in there. And so that's what you do when you can no longer rely on the federal government for your information. It's shocking that we're at that point, but that's the tragic reality. I mean, a lot of the policies are set at the state level anyway, but the U.S. government still has always had an important advisory role and advocacy role, and now you can't rely on it anymore.
You mentioned
and the reason that's relevant, I get asked on a lot of interviews, someone from the ACIP committee said that. What do you say? What do you say to that? And I say, well, the first thing, and they don't like the answer, but I say, the first thing, it doesn't matter, because in the bigger scheme, because there's no science coming out of the ACIP committee or the advisory committees anymore. And they say, well, parents still listen to that stuff. And I say, that's the problem. And So this makes
the advisory committee on immunization practices, part of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC. That's what that is, ACIP. But going back to the pediatricians and their representative group, what's it called? The American Pediatricians
American Academy of Pediatrics. And you have to be careful, because now there are all these anti-vax groups that have names.
Sure, right.
That they make sound a little like it, and so we got to be really careful.
We saw that happen with climate. Our friend Dr. Michael Mann, who you wrote a book with, talked about, we saw them doing that then, and now, of course, they're repeating those tactics, making up organizations.
So if you see the word American written with 2 M's, that's usually a red flag.
3 Ks. Let me, though, ask you about that, because pediatricians, one of my best friends, by the way, I forget if we've ever talked about this on or off air, but he was at Yale when you were there. I think he knows you, Dr. Kenneth Zatz, who is a pediatrician. You know him?
I do, yeah.
So he's he's one of my closest friends, and he's constantly on top of this and so upset about it, and that because specifically pediatricians are being demonized for giving vaccines, and the way it goes is that they're making money off of the vaccines. And Ken will tell you that's not where we make money. We don't make any money.
That's a major anti-vaccine talking point. It's an old school anti-vaccine talk. I mean, that's the kind of old school stuff Kennedy used to talk about when I talked to him 10 years ago. So they just bring all that back. I'll tell you the difference in Kennedy and other public remarks from when I was asked by the NIH to talk to him, and that's why I wrote the book, Vaccines Do Not Cause Rachel's Autism, 10 years ago versus today. The difference in the rhetoric is this. Now, in addition to the old school talking points, they add talking points from the health wellness influencer industry. So the difference now is, he says his usual BS about the MMR vaccine. He says it's a leaky vaccine. It's not. He says it's contaminated with aborted fetal remnants. It's not. He says it declines 4% of protection per year. If anything, it's 0.04% per year. So he's off by a factor of 100. Or he says the hospitalizations are due to quarantine and isolation. No, these kids are sick with measles, pneumonia, encephalitis, and other things. So that's, it's tragic that he's head of health and human services and doing this in the middle of a measles epidemic. But that's the kind of stuff he might have said 10 years ago. The difference now is he says, or you can get an infusion of vitamin A, budesonide, and clarithromycin. You're saying, well, where did that one come from? And then you realize this is all out of the health and wellness and influencer industry. Have you ever wondered why there are always antiparasitic drugs? Ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, fenbendazole. It's because it's the business model. You can buy, it's cheap. You can buy a bucket of it in bulk. You can repackage it, jack up the price, then you sell it with a $1,600 telehealth visit. That's the business model. Unfortunately, the other end of the aspect of the business model is to push this nonsense, they have to denigrate mainstream scientists and biomedical scientists. So that's why they go after me and why they demonize me and, to portray me as this cartoon villain or public enemy, because I'm bad for business. So it's not only bad for politics, it's bad for business. And so I'm hurting their bottom line. It's one of the reasons they're so aggressive and going up against me.
Mentioned measles, pediatricians. Got to ask you about the flu. It's been particularly bad this year, and there's a new flu vaccine application from Moderna. They have a new mRNA flu vaccine, and we all learned the last couple of days. The headline is this: U.S. health officials defend rejection of Moderna's flu vaccine. FDA refuses to review Moderna's application for mRNA flu vaccine. FDA won't consider a new mRNA vaccine for flu, despite the technology's life-saving purposes. What is this all about? I mean, I've read the articles. I can.
Well, first of all, it's preceded by the fact last year that Health and Human Services has one of their agencies is called BARDA. That's the one that organized Operation Warp Speed for our COVID vaccines. And what happened was Kennedy and HHS canceled some big mRNA contracts for a number of vaccines. I think it was like 2 contracts. One was 500 million, one was 700 million, all for ideological reasons. This is, with all of these new viruses accelerating, we have pandemic threats coming in from new respiratory viruses here on the Gulf Coast, insect-transmitted viruses. I'm worried about yellow fever coming back. And then we've got all the state actors making bioweapons. We need to have a whole armamentarium of vaccines. And so the first thing they did last year was cancel the contract. Now they come up with this phony baloney argument that that Moderna didn't follow the prescribed rules for testing the vaccine. So they spend hundreds of millions of dollars to do these clinical trials. All of a sudden, they're not going to review the dossier. It doesn't sound right to me, because that's not how it works. The way, many of our vaccines go through the FDA as well. And it's a carefully orchestrated dance. You don't just submit a dossier cold. You submit the dossier after a lot of iterative discussions. It's actually a formal process. They're called pre-IND meetings, and you hold these pre-IND meetings where you get it all straight in terms of what the FDA is expecting in terms of the clinical trial design, any specifics about what goes into the vaccine. There are no surprises in this business. Everything is carefully discussed and orchestrated. So I can't say. Again, I don't have the inside baseball. I wasn't at the table, but almost certainly there was an agreement between Moderna and, like there would be any drug company, and the FDA on what they wanted to see in the clinical trial design, because it's too big an investment. Otherwise it'd be too risky for the company to do it. So the FDA undoubtedly had signed off on that clinical trial design, and then for them to turn around in this sort of seemingly very arbitrary way, said, no, we don't like it, we're not going to review it. First of all, it's devastating financially for the company, but it's not like they can just repeat all those trials. It could be another hundreds of millions of dollars in investment. So it reminds me of the old Monty Python Holy Grail. These are knights who say neat. They all of a sudden bring us another shrubbery, and it's crazy. It seems to me very arbitrary, very unprofessional. It also seems like from what I can read, and I don't have any more knowledge than you do in terms of the public reports, but it sounds like the head of CBER has gone against his own people, and they're shocked by the decision.
Yeah,
well. It seems like amateur hour to me.
Well, it is amateur hour in the federal government because anywhere you look, there is infighting, and it could be political appointees against each other, like we're hearing about this Wall Street Journal reporting on Department of Homeland Security with Kristi Noem and Corey Lewandowski, like they're at odds with all of each other, or whether it be at FDA or CDC. But the Food and Drug Administration Wednesday backtracked on its refusal to review Moderna's mRNA flu vaccine while making an unusual public defense of its decision on drug approvals. So it's hard to follow, but apparently the decision was made by this guy, Dr. Vinay Prasad, who became infamous during the pandemic, in my opinion. He's the top vaccine regulator. He overrode staff recommendations and blocked the process. It looks like even within the FDA, he was at odds. And the spokesman for Department of Homeland Security said the agency had asked the company, Moderna, to use a high-dose flu vaccine as a control product in people 65 and older in a large study of vaccine. The company used a GSK, a different pharmaceutical product, instead. And the Department of Health and Human Services said it had exposed older trial participants to, quote, increased risk of severe illness. Moderna, of course, disputes that. They outlined all kinds of meetings that they had. This is why it's important. I don't mean to bore people, but they had these meetings with the government, and they kept approving what they were doing.
Yeah, that's the way these processes work. They're very, these meetings are not sort of casual meetings like, two dudes talking on Zoom or whatever platform. It's a carefully orchestrated process. It's a formal meeting where notes are taken, and there is usually after one of these pre-IND meetings, the FDA, and the way you ask the question is very precise, and usually there's a formal document that comes after the meeting. So I would imagine there's a paper trail somewhere there that would back up the company, but I guess we'll find out. But that's good news that they reversed their decision, because you really need these vaccines.
Another point I read in learning about this is that Robert F. Kennedy believes that vaccines should be tested against an inert placebo. But that position is widely rejected by, I think, people like yourself, because then people would think they were getting vaccinated and they weren't, and they wouldn't be protected, and you would put them in harm's way. So it's completely unethical to give people a placebo to test a vaccine. What is the deal there? Why does RFK think that? And is it true that it's unethical?
Well, first of all, most childhood vaccines are tested against placebos, and that's how clinical trial design typically works. But what's in that placebo, again, is agreed upon by the FDA in terms of what the vaccine is and what the most appropriate placebo is, and what's ethical. So once again, I'm almost certain the company would have had that discussion, especially knowing what Kennedy was all about. They would have said, this is what we're proposing to do. You sure it's okay? You sure you're okay with this? Because we don't want to start investing hundreds of millions of dollars and then have you kind of move the goalposts on us. But despite all of that, it looks like that's what happened. But it's good if it's going to get reversed.
Hopefully that's the case. What else are you seeing coming out of HHS that's concerned you since this administration took power back? And I also just, the bigger picture here is really, I think, pretty disconcerting.
Well, one of the things that I'm worried about, Pete, is, in addition to reversing, all of our gains in vaccines and having measles and whooping cough come back, we're going to have other diseases come back. So that's problem one. Problem two is I worry about our nation's biosecurity and pandemic preparedness, because now we're not making new vaccines for future coronaviruses that are emerging, for maybe future Ebola-like viruses, what are called filoviruses, for the next influenza. So that whole pipeline, I worry, is drying up. And then, where I am on the Gulf Coast, we could have yellow fever coming back. We have dengue coming back. We're going to need a whole generation of viruses for those tropical diseases. That's why we set up the tropical medical school here, because the National School of Tropical Medicine, because of climate change and urbanization, these diseases are all coming back in a big way. That's the last chapter of the new book. What are the vaccines being stockpiled for that? And then third, I worry about the childhood infections coming back. And fourth, something that nobody really talks about And again, I don't have security clearance, so I don't have the inside baseball on this, but what I've seen from the Washington Post and others is our enemies, our bad state actors like North Korea and Iran and Russia are expanding their bioweapons capability. And what are we doing to combat against that? So it feels like everyone's asleep in Washington about that. So that worries me. The last thing, Pete, that I'm worried about is what I'm seeing with the rhetoric and other things that are happening. You've got these attacks on the biomedical journals, the journal going after Annals of Internal Medicine, all the JAMA. And then you've got these sort of pseudoscience journals, actually, or WordPress documents that are made to look like journals with editorial boards with people of uncertain character or background. And then the threats to cutting the National Institutes of Health. Here's what I'm worried about is going on. And I've written about this on an open access article for, next to Baylor College of Medicine is Rice University, and there's something called the James Baker Institute for Public Policy. And I wrote it on their website. I'm a member of the Baker Institute. It's a little complicated, but just give me
Sure, yeah,
one minute to explain it. So if you know medical history, back in 1910, there was a man named Abraham Flexner, and Flexner was tasked by the Carnegie Foundation to visit every medical school in the United States and Canada. And that wasn't easy to do back in 1910. He lived on a train for a year and visited every medical school. And he shut down and issued this report, which is called, the nickname is the Flexner Report, but it's this Commission on Medical Education. And in it, he pointed out, how disastrous were the homeopathic medical schools and what were called the eclectic medical schools, pushing all these botanicals. And they were basically quack medical schools. And he shut them down. And, his gold standard at the time was the new Johns Hopkins Medical School, which was kind of the pinnacle of scientific medicine in America, and said, this is what we need to do. We need to create. And that completely revolutionized medical education. So back then, there was a fight between what was called scientific medicine, as exemplified by Johns Hopkins or Penn, versus what they called sectarian medicine, meaning, homeopathy, eclecticism. And Flexner was successful in shutting down the sectarian medical schools. This is what Kennedy's bringing back, in my opinion. This is what the article says, but now instead of calling it eclecticism or homeopathy, it's the wellness influencer industry.
Right.
And it's bringing back a whole system of pseudoscience in a parallel universe of quackery. But at the expense of real scientific medicine, which he's trying to shut down. So it's like the revenge of sectarian medicine. And that, when you put it in that context, you then start to understand all the stuff he's doing, denigrating vaccines, attacking the American Academy of Pediatrics, attacking the New England Journal of Medicine, all of the journals, attacking the medical schools, threatening to cut off their funding. That's what's at stake here. Basically, it's a complete destruction of our system of biomedicine as we know it. And that includes the biotech companies, and then all of the innovation in biotech that's been coming out. He wants to shut it all down just so his wellness influencer friends can sell the snake oil. And that's what I think could be going on.
And they're getting rich, his wellness influencer friends. I mean, there's no doubt about it. His affiliations with that whole industry and individuals in that industry is pretty well documented, right?
Yeah, well, as I said, it's, a lot of it is based on buying up whatever is available in bulk and, like ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine, repackaging, jacking up the price, and you charge it with a very expensive telehealth visit. It's just very corrupt. So I'm really concerned about that. And the reason that that's important to know is because I think too often a lot of both the mainstream media as well as my colleagues in academic medicine, the academic health center, just kind of cherry pick the individual things that Health and Human Services is doing. They just focus on that one thing about what Prasad did with
RNA.
the RNA, or what he said about the MMR vaccine being a leaky vaccine. And then the news cycle is you focus on that one thing for 24 hours, and then it's gone and you move on to the next thing. But in that you miss this gradual, step by step by step by step deterioration of our whole system of biomedicine, and propping up this alternative universe of corruption, and destroying what's been so successful and saved so many American lives. And that's what I worry about.
And not only, I was going to ask you next, not only saved American lives, but the things that save American lives save the lives of people all over the world. And so I wondered, how much NIH has been cut. We heard about this a lot at the beginning with Doge, and I wonder about USAID basically being destroyed, and how that's affected other impoverished nations and their public health issues. What about those two, do you want to say?
Yeah, well, there's a few things. So you're right. First of all, a lot of those vaccines were all developed either by the NIH or NIH funding, right?
Right, yeah.
That's true, right? Polio vaccine was done through the National Infantile Paralysis Foundation, but John Robinson or Schneerson developed the Haemophilus influenza type B vaccine. And by the way, he wants to now make bacterial meningitis vaccines optional. And after I've taken care of so many sick kids in pediatric ICUs, now he wants, with bacterial meningitis, now he wants to bring it back. So there is that. Now with the NIH budget, what's interesting is Congress seems to be at least fighting back, and they're keeping the budgets going, which is good. But the other problem is all of the psychological warfare, because on an individual grant, you don't know if there's going to be cut by Doge, or, they kind of string you along. So, for seasoned old guys, we've got other mechanisms, but for young people, it's already hard. It's a really hard thing to get an NIH grant for a young person. Now you add this uncertainty. They're like, I'm out, so the brain drain is really
concerning. Ask you about that. How do you measure a brain drain? And does that mean that the same people are going to continue their pursuit of science and medicine, but maybe just not in America? Or drop out because America is the gold standard, is the only place to get funding?
So several things are happening. So this week I opened up my science magazine, which is put out by the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And the lead article is the government has now fired 10,000 PhD employees. This is the first really tangible evidence of brain drain. But, I worry that, first of all, young people are leaving science for other ventures. Or, what if you're a undergraduate chemistry major right now, or a high school student thinking of what to major in? You're thinking twice now about majoring in science. So, we are a nation built on the greatness of our research universities and institutions, and all of that is also unraveling. And again, it comes back to our national security. This is a security issue now for the country. So I forgot the original thread that we were talking about.
Well, we were talking about NIH and brain drain, but what about USAID?
Oh, and USAID, again, a lot of that's been cut. There's actually been a couple of attempts to measure the impact of those USAID cuts in terms of lives lost, because, some of those USAID and State Department grants are going to fund what's called PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. That's the plan to get people on antiretroviral drugs all over the world, or provide anti-malarial drugs or bed nets, or directive therapy for tuberculosis, or what I worked on, which is to get people access to low-cost donated medicines for neglected tropical diseases. So this is enabling diseases to come back, and people are not getting their medication. So it's having a direct impact on lives as well.
When USAID is funding, resourcing, carrying out public health campaigns in countries all over the world, some Americans say, well, why not us? Why not us first? And it's a very short-sighted thing, because even if you were entirely self-interested, viruses travel. So you want to stop Ebola in Africa before it gets to New York. You want when we fund these public health campaigns, they aren't just the right thing to do morally. It's also in the self-interest of the public health of Americans. Is that a fair thing to?
Yeah, I think it's two parts. It's what you say. I mean, right? I mean, now everything is so interconnected when these diseases come back. I mean, measles is now getting introduced into the U.S. all the time now that we've got an unvaccinated population. That's igniting measles epidemics. But the other part of this is for these global programs to work. Ever since World War II, the world has always looked to the US for leadership, and to be sort of the dominant partner in this, to say, and this is, in my view, what made us such a powerful country. It's not because we're threatening countries with going to war, it's because we exercise leadership on our humanitarian values, and then the others follow. All right. I mean, we basically, had as much or any country to in terms of building UNICEF and the World Health Organization and the United Nations, and the other countries sort of followed our lead, and to just decapitate all of that by bailing out in such a dramatic fashion is so destabilizing.
I guess I have this really, I know this is stupid and naive, but I always have this feeling or idea that you can just fix it with new leadership. That all the things that got defunded and turned off, and that you can just come back in with a new administration, and be like, we're changing course. It's a dumb binary, and I know it's not how life works and how policy works and how public health and medicine scientific research works. But what could change? What could be fixed given new leadership in the federal government?
Well, right now, remember, we're still in free fall, right? We've not hit our nadir. We've not hit bottom yet by any means. I mean, we're still, it's only February, Pete, right? And we've already got measles and pertussis back. I think we're gonna start seeing polio show up in the wastewater again. All the bacterial meningitis infections, and then people not trusting their pediatrician, but you'll sell a lot of ivermectin, I guess, and hydroxychloroquine and all this other nonsense. So we've not hit our bottom yet, and to me, I don't even like to think in those terms, because I think I think part of the problem is that our leaders of academic health centers too often just say, "Oh, just hunker down for a couple of years and it'll go back." And for reasons to talk about in a minute, that's not true. But second is, it doesn't feel that way to me. This feels like a different country from the one I grew up in. So I think it has a more enduring feel to it, and so it's not like it's gonna, as you say, it's not going to be binary. It's not going to turn on a dime. And we're going to have to find a way, not to just hunker down and wait for things to get better, but lean in productive ways. And what are the alternatives? What can we do through the private sector and biotech? I mean, you're already seeing coalitions of states forms because we can no longer trust the CDC or elements of health for the federal government. So I think that's where we need to focus our energies now.
Come back to that point though about hunkering down and why that doesn't necessarily is ineffective, and why any academic leadership would even have that point of view. Because I also just think that the country is different than the one you grew up in, than the one I grew up in, because of the point I keep making and keeps us together, I guess, which is the loss of respect for institutions and experts, and the fact that you're listening to a podcaster and not your doctor. That
and this is by design. Remember, when I can't tell you how many Zooms I've been post-pandemic on loss of trust in science and public health, and the Zooms always start out the same way. Everybody kind of hand-wringing, "Oh, what did we do wrong? What did we do wrong?" And I said, "Look, during the pandemic, as there always will be in pandemics, the messaging will be imperfect because we're in a pandemic and things are changing. And I can recite chapter and verse of the things that we actually did get wrong. But in the big picture of things, the messaging wasn't that bad. The real problem was you had the bad actors the Fox News talking heads, weaponizing it on every chance they get and finding every way to portray us as enemies or cartoon villains. I mean, how many times have I heard of, Fox News going after me, saying, of course, he's in a secret cabal with Fauci because he has funding from the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Diseases of the NIH. And this is from a guy who's comes from a medical school where his whole microbiology department is funded by NIIT. So it's so cynical and disingenuous. And which is a side point, that's another part of when we're going to step up science literacy training in K through 12. It's not just teaching about the second law of thermodynamics. It's also about the processes of science and what it means to get a grant and how the money doesn't go in your pocket. It goes to the institution and what it's used for. So we're going to have to rebuild all that as well.
Well, as long as you're around to keep talking about it and keep doing what you're doing, I so appreciate you joining me today. And whenever you do, and all the work that you're doing, people in the chat right now in the live chat talking about how heroic you and your work and your colleagues have been. And
it's very kind. Well, you've been such a hero too, Pete, and giving me this voice and another scientist and sticking by it, and not, so many people in your position, do take the easy way out and either push the disinformation or almost as bad, create this false equivalency, that the wackadoodle stuff gets is the same as the real science. And that happens a lot too. And you've not done that. And I can tell you how appreciative I am.
I have just enough humility to realize that I don't know how to do research. Never done it. Don't know how to do it. Can't do it. Doing a Google search is not research. Talking to your AI is not research. There's so much more that has to be done. And that's why we respect the actual experts who've been doing it their whole life. And more importantly, have the credibility to go along with the career, which of course you do. Peter Hotez, always a pleasure, my friend. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you for watching live, those of you who did. And we really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Pete. You're the best.